All right, great, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar presentation and continuation of our series. Today's presenter is Jonathan Doe, a Associate Dean of Research and Global Engagement in the School of Business here at Villanova University. He's got a great presentation planned for us today, so I'm not going to take up any more of his time and hand it on over.
Thanks so much, Liesl. Great to see you all. It's kind of comforting to be able to come together with some Villanova colleagues in this fashion. Thanks, Liesl, for putting this series together. We don't have a lot of time, just a half an hour, so I'm going to kind of jump right in. So let me first just give you a little context in terms of my background and how I kind of got interested in developing these cases and exercises. So actually, prior to the information that you see on the slide here, I was a trade negotiator with the US government for about 5 years in the early 90s. And I worked on the implementation of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement and then the NAFTA. And those of you who were around at that time and were following, especially the NAFTA, know that there was some criticism of the original NAFTA deal for not being responsive to labor and environmental concerns that maybe are associated with a trade agreement with a developing country like Mexico. And so subsequent to the trade agreement being finalized, when Bill Clinton was elected, he asked for supplemental agreements on labor and the environment. And that was kind of my first introduction, or one of my early introductions, I should say, to the tension between some aspects of business and sustainability and the environment. And the tension that I was interested in at that point had to do with trade policy and environment. And so my stimulus for becoming interested in developing cases and simulations really was this experience that I had as a trade negotiator. So since that time, I've really been researching and teaching at the intersection of international business and what we used to call corporate responsibility, but I'm going to now call sustainability. I teach a global sustainability management course. I'm teaching in the fall. Still have plenty of room in the classroom or the virtual classroom, whatever it's going to be. So if you have any students that are interested, no prerequisites really. And so really since that experience in the early 90s, when I moved over to academe, I have continuously been writing and preparing cases, simulation, and role plays that I use in my classes, but then partly because I'm the author of a textbook, and I just happened to receive this in the mail yesterday. This is the 11th edition. You can't see it. How do I get that to show? Anyway, yeah, there you go. Of this textbook that I'm a co-author of. I have an outlet for them as well. So I have another, I guess, incentive structure, if you will, to prepare these. Now, I should say that when I say cases, all of the cases that I write have some kind of role play or exercise associated with them. And so they're kind of a combination of these different types of pedagogical tools. So when we say cases, they might mean different things to different people, but typically they're about a business challenge or problem that a company or another kind of organization is facing. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter, sometimes they're really short. And then relatedly, we have something called simulations. I think I have somebody I need to admit, or maybe it's just a chat. Lisa, I'm gonna let you worry about that unless you need me to turn host role over to you. All of my cases have some kind of role player simulation associated with them. Some of them are based on primary data, so interviews and interactions that I had with the actual company organization, and some are using secondary data alone. Almost all the cases and simulations that I've prepared have a kind of a business component, and they have a sustainability component. And I'm not going to kind of go through them all, but I've actually written quite a lot of them now. These are some that I've either authored myself, co-authored with another faculty member, or co-authored for a student. And I'd like to talk about really the first two that I prepared, and they're the first and the last on this list. When I was working on US-Canada trade policy, there was a dispute between the US and Canada because the province of Ontario required that beer sold in Ontario be produced in Ontario because of a refillable bottle requirement. Imagine if you were trying to sell bottles in Ontario and then send the bottles back to wherever they came from, St. Louis in the case of Anheuser-Busch or elsewhere. It wouldn't make economic sense. So effectively, Ontario was mandating that beer sold in Ontario be produced in Ontario, which to some was a violation of a trade principle, if you will, which is essentially non-discrimination. And this was a very active dispute between the US and Canadian government, but it really just concerned the Ontario policies. And when I left government, I wrote up a case, a simulation, really an exercise, and I used it in the classroom. And then I wrote up an article about it and submitted and published the article. Sometimes I find sharing the screen with multiple documents doesn't work, so I'm hoping that maybe this time it will work. That's not what I was looking for here. I was going to show it to you. Here we go. So this is the article that can you all see this? Is this the article reproducing reconcilable differences? No. Okay. I need to do something different with my screen share, and maybe I just won't bother, because maybe I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again, and I'll try to go to the article. Here we go. Share. How about that? Good. So I actually wrote up this article that describes the simulation, and the bulk of the article talks about the simulation and why it's interesting and why it's important. And then I actually have instructions. So if somebody wanted to do this themselves, as part of the article, I have instructions for a debrief, and then I have some supplemental information about trade and the environment and the different kinds of disputes. And you'll notice that one of the things that I do frequently throughout these cases and simulations is a very simple structure. And many of you have probably used this as well, where I break the students into different stakeholder groups. So it's a little small, but I'll just read it. These are the instructions. You'll be assigned to one of 6 groups: the US government, the Canadian Ontario government, US brewers, a coalition of US and Canadian environmental groups, including Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth, US Canadian aluminum producers, because another industry that was disadvantaged by this policy were the aluminum producers that make cans that beer goes in. And then a panel, a trade dispute panel that ultimately resolves it. So the way this simulation unfolds is this GATT-WTO panel, which is kind of the arbiter, lets each of these stakeholder groups make a presentation about why their perspective and their position is correct and consistent with both trade and environmental policies. And then the GATT-WTO panel kind of rules, if you will, or makes a decision. And then there's kind of a debrief afterwards. And so this article kind of walks the instructor, the faculty member, through how this would work in the classroom, and also provides the actual instructions that students would use in going through this exercise. And this is really the model that I've used ever since. I tend to be kind of a simple person, and when I find something that works, I continue with it. And so that really is the kind of the very simple model that I use for all of these cases and all of these simulations, with some variations that I have prepared. So the one on the bottom works very similarly. You may have also followed some time back a dispute between the United States and the European Union about trade in products that had been produced with genetically modified organisms. And what's interesting here is there's a cultural element, in the sense that the US and EU culture has a very different perspective on food safety and different approaches to whether something is fit to be sold on the store shelves. And so this one, again, unfolds very similar to the one that I just mentioned. I have some others in here, a relatively recent one on Dansko, another one on a cross-sectoral partnership between Oxfam America and Swiss Re, helping African farmers adjust and adapt to climate change. One that involved primary information, if you will, was about Chiquita. I happened to be at a conference. There was a presentation from a senior vice president from Chiquita, the banana company, about how they essentially use the sustainability strategy to turn around the company. I approached the speaker and said, hey, I'd be interested in writing up a case on your whole experience. Would you be willing to cooperate? Yes, I would. So that's a case that actually uses primary data. Now, as I've gotten busier and as I've felt the need to kind of create some leverage in this whole process, I've empowered students to draft these cases, because I now have a model or template in my head, which I can communicate and share with the students about really what I'm looking for in these cases. And so the 5 that you have here were fully authored by students. Don't know if anybody remembers Jackie Johns from a number of years ago, student at Villanova. She was a business student, but very active in Business Without Borders and sustainability initiatives. So she prepared this case on Coca-Cola in India. Some of you may know that Coca-Cola got into some trouble in India for different ways that water was either used, transported. There was a contamination scandal, if you will. Tom's Shoes, which many of you are familiar with, the CEO of Tom's came to Villanova a number of years ago, and I got to chat with him, and that got me interested in that company, and some others. So increasingly, the students are writing the cases, and I'm really kind of supervising or finalizing or formatting, if you will. Now, here's another example, just to kind of underscore the point about how I present and position these cases to students. Most of these cases are both about international business and about sustainability. They're kind of a combination. So this is an excerpt from the final section of the Chiquita case, where I have a series of questions for instructors, me or whomever uses the case as part of the textbook, might use in a discussion, and then this exercise. And you'll see it takes almost exactly the same format as the one that I mentioned earlier. I typically have 5 or 6 groups. There's typically some kind of debate or discussion, and then there's some kind of resolution or some decision process that occurs after that. So I'm going to summarize my experience on this slide, and then I have some other examples if you would be interested in seeing them, but then I want to take some questions. So what inspires the kind of the topic or the focus of the case? Somehow I didn't list it here, but really my own prior practitioner experience was the initial genesis and origin for the first couple cases that then became the basis for others. Things that are happening in the news. So for example, Starbucks entered India a couple years ago and has an interesting joint venture partner, which is Tata, the big Indian conglomerate. And Ratan Tata, who is kind of the patriarch of the company, has been known as having a strong sustainability orientation. There's some excellent videos of the two of them, of Howard Schultz and Ratan Tata, talking about their commitment to sustainability and corporate responsibility. I mentioned this conference attendance, where I just happened to be a place where this person from Chiquita happened to be presenting, and I approached her. Maybe sometimes my own research, but usually it's stimulated by something in the environment, the context. Again, once I kind of figured out how I wanted these cases to be organized and unfold, I was able to essentially train students to write them or to draft them. It always requires me to really, edit, restructure, move things around, etc. But it is something that I think through repetition becomes easier. Now, again, I had a ready outlet. I'm an author of this textbook, so I was aggressively looking for cases. And just as a kind of a side point, why was I looking for cases for this textbook? Because a lot of textbook writers just use cases that are already out there. So there's some ethical issues for me as an author of a textbook that sells for $220. And I have very mixed feelings about that whole model. And I feel like I need to put the most original value-added content in that textbook for me to even begin to justify this value proposition. I'm not going to just borrow cases that are already available out there from some other source. So I made it as a commitment on my part that I or students or some combination were going to prepare every case that appears in that book. There's one exception, which is just a legacy. What that means is they need refreshing a lot, because you may have seen earlier that I had one having to do with BP. This was before the BP disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And for sure, that was not a case, and it was lauding BP for its sustainability. And those of you that follow BP may have known BP had a pretty good reputation for sustainability. It turns out that was very superficial. So that case had to go. And for other reasons, we send the textbook out for review to faculty members who provide feedback. We're constantly replenishing. So in a new edition, there might be 3 or 4 new cases, updates of existing cases, et cetera. So using your own classes, that was my primary motivation. I wanted to have some interesting original materials that traded on my experience as a trade negotiator. Other textbook authors are often looking for cases. There are case clearinghouses in business anyway, and I'm sure there are in other domains. And then there are some journals that actually publish cases or publish articles about cases. So let me stop there. I've used about the first 14 minutes of our session, and I've realized I'm kind of racing through this a bit. But given that we only had a half hour, I thought it best to just throw some information out there, like spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, and then see what questions you might have. And I'm fine just having you unmute yourself. I don't think we're not such a large group that we need to do the chat unless you're more comfortable with that. So I would be happy to take any questions from faculty or other colleagues about sort of how this has worked for me and how it, it might work for some of you. The infamous Zoom pause.
I know, right? It's the worst. This is really interesting, Jonathan. So just to clarify, the case studies that you mentioned here, they're all in your book it's just been released. They're not available online.
They're all in my book, except for some of them are no longer available because we essentially have put them to rest. The BP one for obvious reasons, others just because they were a little bit older and stale. That Coca-Cola in India case is one that continues to have kind of currency because Coca-Cola continues to refine its sort of sustainability outlook. So even though it's interesting that it's still called Coca-Cola in India, but the whole second half of the case is not so much about Coca-Cola in India. It's about all the things that Coke ended up having to do after getting into such trouble in India. So we made that case because every time we have a new edition of the book, we revise the cases, we update them. And so that case ended up having more life to it than it would have otherwise, because this India story is now an old story because Coke had continued to receive pressure from various sources and also developed interesting collaboration, and notably with World Wildlife Fund, where my wife worked for 18 years, around freshwater management, around Coke's management of water resources. I'm willing to provide any of these to anybody. I have all the PDFs from my book, so I'm happy. I'm not sure if I'm violating. Here's another way that I justify the ethics of authoring a $220 textbook is I'm pretty loose and easy about making these available to anybody that would like them available. When I've guest lectured in some other classes at Villanova, like especially in sustainability, I've occasionally used some of these materials as well. Yeah, so they're definitely available, and if anybody would like any of them in particular, I'm happy to share them.
So I do have a question.
Yes.
This is Chuck Coe from Chemical Engineering.
Hey, Chuck.
And I teach alternative energy. And I'm just absolutely shocked to hear you say that India is in the forefront of sustainable behavior and looking at corporations and punishing them for bad behavior. When I think of India, I think of the pollution from mobile transportation and diesel fuels that turn white shirts, black and cause huge respiratory problems. So can you comment a little bit about India's government and the segmentation of parts of it being sustainably oriented and other parts?
So if I suggested that I thought India had a world-class environmental regulatory apparatus or even approach, I certainly did not mean that. What I meant to say was that Ratan Tata and the Tata organization has an interesting history of corporate responsibility, what we might call sustainability, that emanates from its role in providing social goods to its employees because the government is unable. So think back to the early years of US history, where you had companies providing, housing and healthcare and education and a whole suite of what we economists would call public goods, because the government was unable or unwilling to. And whether that's really sustainability, I think, maybe that's not quite the right term. But the point was that Howard Schultz from Starbucks and Ratan Tata from Tata had some common perspectives about the role of corporations in society, that corporations needed to do more than just make money. They needed to look after their stakeholders. Now, is Tata looking after its stakeholders as well as a government would? No. As well as maybe a first world corporation would? Definitely not. So I did not mean to generalize at all about the overall conditions in India. I have only been to India a couple of times, but I can't agree more that the overall conditions are pretty atrocious. And in fact, some of you may be interested to know, and maybe you know this already, the air pollution problem in India, especially from particulates, is actually significantly worse than China. We always cite China, like Beijing in the winter, especially because of all the deforestations to the west, that China has this horrible air pollution. It's worse in India. It's worse in Mumbai. It's worse in Delhi. So I'm with you 100%, Chuck, and I didn't mean to suggest otherwise.
Okay. Can I just follow up with one thing?
Sure.
Coca-Cola, did
Yes.
they come down on Coca-Cola for not handling their water properly? Or?
There were two issues. One was Coca-Cola was drawing from aquifers that communities were using for their fresh water. And there seemed to be some evidence that it was draining those aquifers to the point where that fresh water was either not of the same quality it would have been, or was not of the same quantity that it would have been. But then there was another issue, which is kind of interesting. And this one was really around alleged, and I really do underscore alleged, contamination of Coca-Cola products. And this one probably was a manufactured crisis, or a manufactured allegation. There really wasn't solid scientific evidence, but it stuck. And Coca-Cola for a time was kind of the big bad foreign corporation in India, and it had a real reputational problem, which spilled over into its commercial sales as well. And so that was really what's to me interesting about the story is that was the impetus, these criticisms, the stakeholder objections that governments then supported. And again, those of you who know in India know that the sub-central governments, the state governments are very powerful, that got Coca-Cola to say, hey, wait a minute, we got to get our act together. Now the problem is Coca-Cola Atlanta, Georgia does not produce anything. They produce a brand and a recipe and a lot of red and white, images. It's the bottlers that they contract with all over the world that produce the product. So Coca-Cola had a double challenge. One, we got to get our act together when it comes to environmental sustainability, at least enough to preserve our reputation so that we can continue to do business in the places that we want to. And secondly, we got to get the bottlers on board. We got to figure out a way to get them to work with us to be better stewards of water. And I'm certainly not saying Coca-Cola is a great company when it comes to sustainability, but they've come a long, long way. They've come a long way, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So Jonathan Weeder, I have a quick question for you.
Yes, Cal, please.
When you teach this, do you actually define sustainability before you enter into all this stuff? And if so, what's your definition?
So it depends. When I started all this stuff, Cal, the term of art, and it's really not the same thing at all, especially for those of you that are concerned about environmental sustainability. So I want to be a little careful here. But when I got interested in this whole set of issues, the term that we used at the time was corporate social responsibility or corporate responsibility, or sometimes corporate citizenship. So the lens or the focus was on companies being better stewards of their stakeholders broadly defined. And so if you were to look at these early cases, the word sustainability doesn't even appear. It's all about corporate responsibility or stakeholder management or stakeholder responsiveness, et cetera. More recently, I think the vernacular has shifted even within the business community, shifted from corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility to sustainability. And that then does require that we have a discussion about different definitions of sustainability. So I don't provide a single definition. If I had my slides for the first week of class in my global sustainability management class, I provide them with multiple definitions that we discuss. And I might ask the students, which of these do you think is most accurate? Which of these things is most aspirational? Or which do you think is most realistic, et cetera? So I typically don't give them the definition. What else? So, but I would say that one weakness of my case writing is my cases are all way too long. They're way too long. And part of the reason is, Cal, is that I often want to provide background of whatever the topic is within the case, because I don't really know whether I or others are going to be using the cases in the context of something bigger where they're going to have that background. So I tend to shove too much stuff in. And I mentioned earlier that that Ontario beer case, and you may have heard me reference the article, has all this other background on other trade and environmental disputes. Some of you may remember when there was a big dispute over dolphin fisher people using purseine sets. Tuna fisher people using purseine sets that catch dolphin as bycatch. And this is a really interesting dispute between the US consumer and government, and especially Latin American countries where these boats tended to emanate from. And it eventually resulted in that, quote, dolphin safe tuna label that you see. Then there was another similar case having to do with shrimp and turtles. It turns out that when you catch shrimp in a not very sustainable way, you kill sea turtles. So in that discussion of trade and the environment, I feel obliged to bring forward all this other information which may or may not be extraneous. So that was a long-winded answer to a pretty simple question, but no, I don't give them a definition of sustainability. I give them multiple definitions of sustainability, and we discuss them. 3 minutes left. Other questions? Comments?
Hi, Jonathan. Steve Goldsmith from GEV.
Hey, Steve.
I really appreciate the case study approach. Thinking from a pedagogical perspective, I was curious as to the deliverables from the students. Are you asking them to write a white paper summary? And then 2, what do you use as a rubric when you're assessing their write-ups? What are
Yeah. So that's an interesting question, Steve. And I tend to use these case simulations as a kind of fun, interactive class exercise that is interspersed with things that may not be as fun, like lecture, discussion, student presentation, etc. So I will typically have one about 1/3 of the way through the semester and one 2/3 of the way, where students can they have to read the case ahead of time. I ask them to do that. But then they really show up, and the whole class session is this interactive debate or exercise. And I'm glad you asked this question, because it allows me to say the following. I think one of the most successful pedagogical techniques in my experience is to put students in the shoes of a stakeholder which they would not typically be in. So make business students be Greenpeace. Make environmental science students be ExxonMobil. So put people out of their comfort zone in a position, and to have to advocate a position that they would never in a million years be likely to do in other classes or in their professional. And I find it's a real eye-opener. And sometimes the students really get into it, like almost too into it. So there's friction, and sometimes that friction can be positive, it's stimulating. Like when they're petitioning the WTO, I can't believe that the government of Ontario would ever allege that this is anything more than a narrow, selfish way to protect, the market from legitimate US beer producers. I mean, they really put that hat on, they put their feet in those shoes, and they really get into it. And to me, that's the deliverable. That's the deliverable, is having them experience the perspective of an entity, an organization, an individual, a stakeholder that they never would have. And oddly, I typically don't craft assignments around these things, believe it or not. I don't then have them write a paper or reflection. I mean, it finds its way into assignments, right? They'll find their way into assignments, or sometimes I'll have on a quiz, just have a simple question about the case. But the cases and the simulations are really meant to be self-contained. They're experiential, and it's that experience that, to me, is the value added. I'm not saying that it wouldn't also be valuable to have them write something up, but I just haven't used them for that purpose. I've used them for the actual interactive, in-class, engaged experience of the students. And it's worked very well for me, partly because they're super simple, as I said, that these exercises are really simple. I know them well because I've written them. There's the other advantage of developing these cases is this stuff intimately. You're not borrowing from someone else. And so as you can see, I'm pretty passionate and invested in this process.
Great, thank you.
Lisa, I think we're out of time, unless we have one final quick question.
Yeah, if you're willing to stay on, we have another question. We could push it a little bit past the half-hour mark.
But Lisa's told me that these things really work best when we stick to half an hour. So I'm doing my part.
I appreciate that. No, you did great. The presentation was perfect length. Does anyone have any last minute questions before we end the recording? Take that silence as a no.